Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory in for Hashtag of the Year. It's Monday, January 30th. This is Africa 54.
Five failed rainy season triggers the worst drought in 4 decades in the Horn of Africa, leaving 12 million people in Ethiopia acutely food insecure. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield becomes the first U.S. cabinet member to visit Somalia since 2015 and pledges millions of dollars in aid. And calls for police reform in the U.S. mount after 5 police officers in Memphis, Tennessee are caught on video beating a man who later died. All this and more on today's Africa 54.
Well, the last 5 rainy seasons since the end of 2020 have failed, triggering the worst drought in 4 decades in the Horn of Africa. The United Nations says 12 million people in Ethiopia alone are now acutely food insecure. Paul Dio has more.
From southern Ethiopia to northern Kenya and Somalia, around 22 million people are at risk of hunger as the worst drought in 4 decades grips the Horn of Africa. In the afflicted areas, inhabitants who eke out a living mainly from herding and subsistence farming are experiencing their 5th consecutive poorly rainy season since the end of 2020. The UN says 12 million people in Ethiopia, 5.6 million people in Somalia, and 4.3 million in Kenya are acutely food insecure.
While the mother is malnutrition, she may have a child with malnutrition again. While she's in pregnancy, she may be in malnutrition. She might birth a child with malnutrition. So since her breasts do not have enough milk.
According to the UN's children agency, UNICEF, almost 2 million children across Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia require urgent treatment for severe acute malnutrition, the deadliest form of hunger.
Due to the drought, my child did not receive appropriate medical service. We were too busy coping with the drought, saving the livestock, and thinking of the family's survival. All these issues deteriorated the condition of my child.
The Horn of Africa is one of the regions most vulnerable to climate change, and extreme weather events are occurring with increased frequency and intensity. Since 2016, 8 of the 13 rainy seasons have been below average rainfall, according to data from the US-based Climate Hazard Center. Humanitarian groups warn that the situation is only likely to worsen, with the next rainy season from March to May also expected to be below average. Observers say dire conditions in the Horn have been amplified by the war in Ukraine, which has contributed to the soaring food and fuel costs, disrupted global supply chains, and diverted aid money away from the region. Somalia is the hardest hit country, with the drought affecting more than half of its population, about 7.85 million people. Yet, only 55% of the 5.9 billion sought by the United Nations to tackle the crisis has been funded. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Well, since Kenya began its voluntary refugee repatriation program in 2017, more than 85,000 Somali refugees have resettled back home. But due to record drought in the Horn of Africa, thousands of them have returned to Kenya's Dadaab refugee camp to seek relief, only to find themselves locked out of aid programs. Juma Majanga reports from Dadaab.
Omar is making her way to the World Food Programme Aid Distribution Center in the Dadaab refugee camp. As other refugees key in information to get monthly food donations, Halima, like many unregistered returning refugees, has been locked out of aid programs.
The fact that they are not recognized by the government, they are not entitled to, for example, to be issued with plots or even other basic services.
According to humanitarian agencies, returning refugees has been a cyclical issue. However, this time they cannot register again as refugees because Kenya has banned the registration of new refugees in the Dadaab camp for security reasons.
Those who repatriated around 2017 mostly came around 2012 during the big drought of about 10 years ago. So that means there are all those cycles of drought. They are recurrent, and then they happen of every 9 to 10 years. Usually they come and stay for a period of 3-4 years until they are able to go back when the situation gets better.
Halima, a 47-year-old widow and mother of 7, says she returned to Somalia 6 years ago and has come back to the refugee camp to escape drought and hunger back home. Despite the government's policy change on refugees, aid agencies have helped unregistered refugees like Halima get food aid. They are issued with tokens that they cash in for food.
Truth is, life has been hard here. I have to do manual work in the camp, like washing clothes for people to be able to fend for my children. Today, I am so happy the food I have collected is going to help in a big way.
Officials in Kenya say many of the nearly 100,000 Somali refugees fleeing drought and returning here are refugees who repatriated earlier. And as the numbers keep rising, aid groups say their services could be stretched further.
Let's hope that the hardships that are leading to all these population movements reduce. And let's hope that this year the rains are going to be better. Let's hope that this year people are not going to be crossing the border because of conflict on the other side. So that we can focus and provide support to those who are already here in better conditions until they are able to go back to their countries.
Kenya's voluntary refugee repatriation program was meant to provide a durable solution to the refugee situation and help ease congestion in the camps. But with the high rate of returning repatriates, experts say players in the sector will have to rethink the strategy. Juma Majanga for VOA News, Dadaab Refugee Camp, Kenya.
Well, the first U.S. cabinet member to visit Somalia since 2015 has urged the world's donors Sunday to give immediate help to a country facing deadly famine, which she calls the ultimate failure of the international community. Ambassador Lena Thomas Greenfield, U.S. representative to the United Nations, announced that the United States, through the U.S. Agency for International Development, will provide more than $41 million in funding to save lives and meet humanitarian needs in Somalia. Over the weekend, she pledged $2.4 billion in aid to the Horn of Africa to help alleviate famine in that region and call on the rest of the international community to contribute more. The U.S. ambassador to the U.S., the U.S. ambassador to the UN said that perhaps the starkest warning yet about the crisis there is excess deaths during what is now Somalia's longest drought on record, which will almost certainly surpass those of the famine formally declared in the country in 2011, when more than 250,000 people died. Speaking at a meeting with the Somalian President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, Thomas Greenfield said, while a famine has been averted the last time around, that efforts to combat it should be ramped up in order to avoid such an incident in March, April this year, 2023.
I want to stress that the United States is deeply alarmed by the dire humanitarian situation in Somalia, including the threat of famine in the coming months. I heard when I was in Nairobi yesterday that we averted a famine the last time around at stage with 5 straight failed rainfalls, and that we're on the verge of a 6th failed rainfall, and that we have to ramp up our efforts or we will be in a famine in the March-April timeframe. I have tried and am committed to expanding the donor base. The United States provided about 80% of the funding here to help avert the famine this past year. We can't sustain that kind of support on a regular basis, and particularly with the cycle of famine and failed rainfalls that we're witnessing here. So we need your work with your headquarters to find new sources of funding.
Well, more than 500,000 children under the age of 5 in Somalia alone have severe acute malnutrition. According to the UN's Children Agency, millions of livestock essential to families' health and wealth have died. Well, now, for more on the significance on Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield's visit to Africa, Kweku Nwooma, Professor of International Politics, American University, joins me live via Skype from Washington. Professor Nwooma, thanks for joining us. And first, can you kind of give us a sense of why you think this trip took the ambassador to the countries that it took her?
Well, thanks for having me, Vincent. I think that this trip is coming at a wonderful time. Africa needs to be constantly reminded that the United States cares about issues that matter to Africans. In terms of the choice of countries, you can clearly see that Ghana and Mozambique are on the list. These are countries that are on the United Nations Security Council, and the United States needs allies in the Security Council, especially as it tries to contain Russia and also possibly other countries that it is going to have to deal with. But then you see the trip to Somalia, which was not originally announced. That also is important because it reminds us that the United States has an interest in Africa's ongoing security issues and has made significant investments in those countries. And so some of this is routine, but we also see the offensive charm, the new promises that have been made, but also to follow up on things that were promised in December. Then there's also the defensive strategy to make sure that Russia and China do not have Africa to themselves.
And you talk about charm offensive. We see that, in fact, our trip overlapped with that of Janet Yellen. I mean, and then yesterday, or over the weekend, the Secretary of State actually stepped in Africa and Egypt. What should this tell us about the policy, or rather the strategy of President Biden at the moment?
It says that as the United States tries to deal with problems, particularly with Russia, Africa has become a very important player in the global game. And Africa is no longer to be taken for granted, and the United States has to go out and actually compete for Africa's affection. So that's good for African countries. We also have to keep in mind that, for Africans, we cannot wait to be asked to do what is right. We also have to step up and on our own do things that are good for the order of the global system. And so when we have these discussions with the United States, it shouldn't just be about what Americans want. It should be about what we also want, but also what our responsibilities are.
What do you think is the significance of the billions of dollars promised for the Horn of Africa, especially coming at this time?
I think the Horn of Africa is dealing with not just a security issue, but also a major humanitarian crisis. And then we have a major famine brewing in that area. So the United States stepping up and providing this help, it's very important. Part of that, so last year, for example, the American aid accounted for about 80% of what the global system promised Somalia. Without that assistance, people will be dying in Somalia. So that's important. This is something that the United States routinely does, and I don't think it gets enough credit for the good things it does in Africa. And so it's good that she's there. She's bringing attention to these issues, and also mobilizing the international community to step up to help. I listened to her speech in Mogadishu. It's a good speech. Reminded everybody that we all have to step up and prevent the kind of calamities that we're seeing in the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, in few words, what should Africa do?
I think Africans should step up to the plate and be responsible members of the international community, help to preserve the collective security system, not because America is asking us to do so, but because it's in our own interest, but also to show the kind of responsible governance that many of us expect from our leaders. So I'm glad that, in Kenya, for example, she met with William Ruto, and we'll see what Ruto can do in that area in terms of governance and prosperity and investing in women and all the good stuff that they promised when they ran for office.
Appreciate very much, Professor Nuama. That was Kweku Nuama, Professor of International Politics at the American University in Washington, speaking to us via Skype from D.C. Well, now, Guinea's former dictator Moussa Dadis Camara denies responsibility in a 2009 massacre. Camara and 10 other former military and government officials stand accused of the killing of 156 people and the rape of at least 109 women by pro-junta forces at an opposition rally in Conakry Stadium in September 2009. For more insight into the events of 2009, Elsie Kepler, Associate Director of the International Justice Program Human Rights Watch, joins me live via Skype from New York. Welcome, Ms. Kepler.
Hi, thank you.
Now, Mr. Camara denies these charges and actually went back home after staying in exile for a long time. How complicated is this case, or how easy is it to prosecute?
I want to start by flagging how significant the fact is that this trial is going forward at all. This is a first trial of its kind in Guinea. This is the most significant judicial proceeding involving human rights abuses of this nature. It's a rare case like this progressing in domestic courts. And the massacre in 2009 was one of the most brutal incidents in Guinea's history, in which a peaceful protest, political protest, was quashed, and there was a massacre that happened in the stadium, and dozens of women were also raped and sexually assaulted in the stadium. There has been an intense need for justice for these crimes. Their first commitment by the government to hold this trial was back in 2009, which it communicated to the International Criminal Court, and it's been a long and winding road since, and a huge step forward that the trial opened in September. Of course, this trial is complicated. The charges are complicated. You have, close to a dozen individuals who are accused of the charges and are being tried together. These are system crimes, a massacre. It's not just one murder or two murders, widespread sexual assault, also the reality of a cover-up afterwards. So very complicated and complex. And of course, it must be tried fairly and credibly with all the fair trial rights for all the accused, including Camara.
Now, he lived in exile. He could have continued staying outside of the country, willingly came back. But he says, to his defense, that on that material day, he was asleep. He woke up at 11 a.m. and was told that there has been a massacre. Is that a defense enough for a person who was the leader of a country?
The key here is that in a trial, any trial, but including a trial of this nature, is that the judges play the role of assessing the credibility of the information presented. So he will put forward his information. The judges will assess that information. There will be we expect other witnesses who will come forward to provide information about what happened on that day in addition to the accused. You also have hundreds of victims who have joined this proceeding as civil parties in the case. They play a very significant role in the Guinean justice system. Their lawyers are participating in the proceedings, have asked questions, and we expect many of those victims will also take the stand. Obviously, as far as I understand it, there's no allegation that Dadis Camara was at the stadium, so it will involve putting forward information as to linkages between where he was and the acts that were occurring and what orders, if any, he may have given or not in regard to these crimes. So that is all a matter for the lawyers to unpack and also for the judges to ultimately assess. And the standard is there shall be no conviction absent guilt proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
Now, some might see this as making a case for Africa being able to hold their own people accountable rather than send them to The Hague, for example. Do you think this will set a precedent and probably give credibility to African judicial systems?
I think wherever the most serious crimes are committed, the ideal situation is where domestic courts in the countries where the crimes were committed can and do fairly prosecute and try the crimes. We have seen how complicated that can be and how often it's not possible, which is why it is extremely important that the International Criminal Court was created and functions as a court of last resort. Guinea has taken a tremendous step forward, and we're watching it very closely. It could be an important precedent. It's also worth noting that the Guinea example highlights just how difficult domestic cases can be, given that it took 13 years for this trial to get going.
I really appreciate your insights, Ms. Kepler. Elsie Kepler, Associate Director of the International Justice Program, Human Rights Watch. Well, we're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all of our Africa programs, VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, our calls for police reform grows after 5 police officers in Memphis, Tennessee are caught on video beating a man who later died. We'll be right back.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
In South Africa, gunmen killed 8 people Sunday and wounded 3 others at a birthday party in Eastern Cape Province. Police say a manhunt is underway to find the killers. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko arrived in Harare Monday at the start of a 2-day visit to the Southern African country. And U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says human rights were a top item on the agenda as he held talks with Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the foreign minister of the country during a visit to Cairo on Monday. Now, calls for police reform have grown after 5 police officers in Memphis, Tennessee were caught on video beating a man who later died. But as VOA's Veronica Balderos Iglesias explains, there isn't consensus yet among American legislators on how to prevent more violence.
How to move forward after the death of 29-year-old Tyree Nichols in Memphis is what U.S. activists and legislators are trying to find out. Appearing on ABC's This Week, the family's attorney, Ben Crump, stressed the need to address what he called an implicit bias in police culture in the United States.
I believe it's part of the institutionalized police culture that makes it somehow allowed that they can use this type of excessive force and brutality against people of color. And it doesn't matter if the officers are black, Hispanic, or white.
When assessing concrete measures to prevent police brutality, Democratic Senator Dick Durbin told ABC a national conversation is needed.
Banning chokeholds, dealing with no warrant searches, dealing with accreditation of police departments. It's necessary that we do all these things, but not sufficient.
While stressing that not all police officers are to be blamed, Republican Representative Jim Jordan shared his views with NBC's Meet the Press about calls for police reform at the federal level.
I don't know that any training, any ban, there was no chokeholds used there. What they did there was just continue to beat this Mr. Nichols. And so I don't know that that's the answer.
Interviewed on Good Morning America, Derek Johnson, the president of the NAACP, the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization, proposed finding different and holistic approaches to fix the problem.
Agencies must be trained around the art of de-escalating, but also we need to beef up the funding for mental health support.
He added that having a federal database where police misconduct is recorded could also block officers from changing agencies and thus help make a difference. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
Well, and that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.
We are appalled by Iran's executions of Mohammad Mehdi Karami and Mohammad Hosseini, and the sentencing, I should add, of additional individuals to death for involvement in protests. These two individuals were put to death following what can only be called sham trials that were rushed, that lacked any fair trial guarantees. We condemn these executions in the strongest terms. To see to it that the world's preeminent body in many respects has a standing commission that is solely and exclusively trained on the brutality that the Iranian regime is perpetrating against its own citizens. We're going to continue to help the Commission of Inquiry fill the mission that was set out for it, just as we continue to train the eyes of the UN, of our partners, on what's happening to the Iranian people.